Hi, I'm Matt Tarr, and I work as a state wildlife specialist for the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension, where we work with our partners at the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department to help private and community landowners maintain and improve habitat for wildlife. My goal of this presentation is to provide you with some practical considerations to help design your landscapes to make them more attractive and beneficial to wildlife during the winter. Now, if we want to make our landscapes as beneficial as possible to wildlife, it's important to consider every season of the year in our landscape design. Most often, people are especially excited as they plan the beautiful blooms and foliage that will occur during the warm months of the year. But here in northern New England, for about 5 to 6 months of the year, our landscapes can be pretty gray and sparse for wildlife if we haven't considered how those landscapes will function outside of the growing season. So I'll give some ideas for how to make our landscapes more ecologically complete and attractive to wildlife and people during the drab months of the late fall, winter, and early spring. These pictures here are of my 0.3 acre backyard in Gilmanton Ironworks, New Hampshire. This entire area was a rectangular mowed lawn and Japanese knotweed invasion when my wife and I purchased the property in fall of 2017. Step by step, I'm trying to make this landscape more diverse, interesting, and functional for us and for wildlife specifically. Now, I can somewhat envision what I want this area to look like when my design is complete, and although my personality is such that I want to do it all at once, my time and budget definitely don't allow that to happen. And it's actually a good thing, because this project has really taught me the importance of making changes in small increments rather than rushing in to cut things down, pull things out, and purchase and add new things to the landscape. To develop the most functional and cost-effective landscape design, especially one that functions as habitat, it's really important to first understand how all of the existing features of a landscape function as habitat under different conditions throughout the year. Ideally, I recommend that folks take a complete year or two to really observe the parcel you're working with during each season of the year before you make drastic and expensive changes to a landscape. Ideally, make or have a professional develop a base map for your land and then make notes of your observations for things such as which areas get the first sun of the day and which stay sunny all day, which areas puddle and stay wet and which areas are really dry, and what trees and shrubs are present and what time of year do they provide food or cover for wildlife. With this understanding, you can then plan your design to complement and enhance features that are already in place on your property. And you will understand the microhabitats or microclimates of your property, so you can be strategic and most successful regarding where to add features or make expensive changes. Okay, so when we are designing landscapes with wildlife in mind, our design needs to consider all 4 of the primary components that comprise wildlife habitat. Most obviously, we need to maintain, enhance, and/or create landscape features that provide wildlife with food, cover, and water during the winter months. The 4th component of habitat is spatial arrangement. This considers not only how food, cover, and water are arranged on the parcel we're managing, but also how these habitat components on our property are designed to complement those that occur on neighboring properties. The space element acknowledges that most wildlife use multiple properties to meet all of their habitat needs, and the best way to improve the habitat quality of our neighborhood and to attract wildlife to our property is to provide required habitat features that are missing on other properties around us. I'll talk more about the space element of landscape design at the end of this presentation, and I will focus first on the food, cover, and water elements. And here, the plants we choose to keep, remove, or add to our landscape will largely make or break the ability of our parcel to function as winter habitat for wildlife. So in the following slides, I'll suggest particular plant species to retain or to consider adding to your landscape. Please note that many plants can serve multiple functions by providing food and cover as well as water, because many wildlife species meet a large proportion of their water needs through the fruits or seeds they eat. Selecting plants that serve multiple functions just makes sense and can be especially important on small parcels where you must be very strategic with the space that is available. So let's first look at the food component of habitat. This includes plants that have persistent fruit, meaning they hold onto their fruits into winter or even into early spring, and plants that produce seeds or nuts that can be available to wildlife during winter. The food component also includes other animals, such as birds, small mammals, and insects that serve as important winter food for predators. Let's look first at the wide variety of plant species that produce persistent fruit. So here in the Northeast, we have a number of native shrubs that produce persistent fruit. These plants span a range of size and growing conditions, so there is probably one on this list that will fit just about any landscape. For wet sites, Winterberry Holly is the obvious choice because it is easy to grow and its fruits are eaten by a wide variety of birds and small mammals. Winterberry Holly has male and female plants, so you need both to get the bright red fruits. Another holly that is common in northern wetlands, but one I rarely see in landscape designs, is the mountain holly or catberry, which would be a great complement to Winterberry Holly in a wet area of a landscape. A few shrubs can do well in either wet or dry conditions. These include the American highbush cranberry, which often holds onto its fruit into the very early spring and is a favorite among many birds, including cedar waxwings and Bohemian waxwings. The red chokeberry and black chokeberry are both hardy, easy-to-grow shrubs that can grow in very wet or in very dry conditions. And for me, these fruits are definitely aptly named because they are pretty tough to eat without a lot of sugar, but wildlife do readily eat them. And then we have the northern bayberry, which is great for dry sites or wet edges. Its fruits have one of the highest fat concentrations of any wild fruit, so they are especially valuable as a late fall food for migrating songbirds, which are adapted to eat insects during the breeding season. The aromatic leaves of bayberry add additional interest to the landscape. Coralberry, which is also called Indian currant or buckbrush, and snowberry are two shrubs that grow best on dry to moist sites. They have very unique pink or white fruit that add interest, as well as another food option for wildlife. And I don't see these plants very often in design landscapes. For well-drained sites, American holly is very common in many landscapes, and these fruits are readily eaten by resident birds and small mammals. This plant is also pretty deer resistant and may be a good choice in landscapes where deer are super abundant. Other less common landscape plants that grow best on well-drained sites include inkberry, pasture rose, and then the hawthorns, which come in a staggering number of varieties that grow as shrubs or small trees. Staghorn sumac grows as a tall shrub and produces clusters or bobs of hairy drupes. These are favorite winter foods of many resident birds, including eastern bluebirds, American robins, chickadees, downy and hairy woodpeckers, winter visitors such as common redpolls, and small mammals, including red squirrels. This is a great shrub to grow along the edges of a field or at the edges of a yard where you have the space. We also have a few native vines which have persistent fruit, which are valuable for wildlife. Although almost all of the bittersweet you encounter is likely the non-native oriental bittersweet, the Native American bittersweet does occur occasionally. American bittersweet produces its fruits only at the end of each twig, whereas the non-native bittersweet produces fruit all along the twigs. Hermit thrushes are short-distance migrants that often hang around into early winter, and they often return in very early spring before most insects have emerged, so they benefit greatly from having persistent fruits available in their habitats. The other three vines on this list are especially valuable because they produce high-fat fruits, which again are especially important for migrant songbirds. During fall migration, these birds incorporate fruit into their diet and are better able to digest high-fat fruits that are typical of Virginia creeper and greenbrier. And while we're certainly not going to plant or encourage poison ivy, don't be in such a rush to get rid of it in areas where you are unlikely to regularly come into contact with it. Its berries are favorites of a huge variety of wildlife, including downy woodpeckers, all the way up to the huge pileated woodpecker, and all of the songbirds in between, including eastern bluebirds and cardinals. Poison ivy berries are also high in fat, and small mammals, including mice, squirrels, and chipmunks, readily eat the berries. We have 2 species of native conifers that produce persistent fruits, common juniper and eastern red cedar, and I suspect that wildlife use the fruits produced by these 2 species similarly. These high-fat fruits may be particularly valuable winter food for birds such as golden-crowned or ruby-crowned kinglets that primarily eat insects throughout most of the year. Now here in the Northeast, we don't have too many native deciduous trees that hold onto their fruit into the winter. Mountain ash and hackberry are 2 with fruits that are readily eaten by birds and mammals. Persimmon is an interesting species that is native to the southern U.S., and permaculturalists in the Northeast are starting to experiment with hardy varieties. These trees produce fruit the size of a small apple, which is edible by people and is favored by wildlife. And I actually plan to add persimmon to my property this year. Now, although not native, apple trees are a regular part of the New England landscape. Apple trees come in and can be maintained in a variety of sizes to fit most landscapes. Apples are favorites among many medium to large size mammals, including deer and bears. And I have many landowners that I work with who plant small groups of apple trees in forest openings or on the back edges of fields where these wildlife can be observed at a distance away from the home. Woodpeckers readily eat apples as soon as they are ripe, but most birds wait to eat apples until they are overripe and mushy. And by this time, the apples are usually fermented and contain high concentrations of natural alcohols, so it's not uncommon for birds and squirrels to become inebriated after eating these fruits. So it's best to plant apple trees away from structures that birds might strike when they fly away from these trees under the influence. Apples require cross-pollination from another apple variety or from crab apples that usually produce prolific flowers and fruits. The small size of crabapple fruit mean they can be eaten easily by a great variety of mammals and birds, and in the spring, crabapples produce an abundance of beautiful flowers that are loved by pollinators. In most landscapes, full-size mature trees are the features that come along with a property, and with few exceptions, I think most of us consider these trees as pretty permanent infrastructure or the backbone of a parcel. These trees are often expensive to remove from a small lot, and we should think very carefully, after many years of observation, before removing any mature trees that don't pose an immediate safety hazard. Mature trees usually provide many important habitat functions that aren't easily replaced. I'll just mention a few of the wildlife food benefits of some mature trees that are common in most landscapes. Numerous trees produce seeds or nuts that provide valuable winter food. The seeds of these trees range from tiny yellow birch seeds that are often picked off the snow surface by pine siskins, juncos, and white-footed mice, small sugar maple seeds that are a favorite winter food of gray squirrels, beech nuts and acorns that are eaten by small mammals, songbirds such as titmice, blue jays, and woodpeckers, and mammals including raccoons, foxes, and deer, and the hickories which produce large seeds eaten by turkeys, mice, gray squirrels, and flying squirrels. Mature conifers that are common around residential landscapes and that produce seeds used as winter food for wildlife include various spruces, pines, balsam fir, eastern hemlock, and Atlantic white cedar. The spruces, fir, hemlock, and cedars also provide ideal winter cover, which I'll talk about in a bit. I'll now move on to some herbaceous plants and transition into the cover component of habitat. Many perennial herbaceous plants produce seed heads, which, if left uncut at the end of the growing season, can stand up above the snow and provide seeds for mice, many songbirds, and wild turkeys. The plants listed here are native perennials that Dr. Kathy Neal from UNH Cooperative Extension recommends planting to provide flowers for pollinators. All of these plants I've listed here have seed heads that would likely be used by vertebrate wildlife during winter. Numerous native bees also overwinter or lay eggs in standing hollow stalks of perennial flowers. So leaving your flowers uncut is an easy way to help native pollinators like carpenter bees. Native goldenrod gall flies lay their eggs in young goldenrod stems, and the plant forms a gall around the developing larvae that emerge the following spring. Leaving goldenrods standing throughout the winter not only helps this native insect, but also provides a valuable winter food for downy woodpeckers and black-capped chickadees that seek out goldenrod galls in winter to eat the high-protein larvae inside. Woodpeckers tend to make a neat little hole to extract the larvae, whereas chickadees make a messy hole by tearing away chunks of the gall to get inside. All right, so this is where your specific objectives and aesthetic tastes determine what makes sense to you. The areas that you leave uncut into the winter can be formal garden beds and plantings, or they can be wilder, less manicured patches or edges of your property. The top photo is a small patch of wild meadow I just let grow in a corner of my yard, and the photo on the right is a pollinator planting I leave uncut between my small lawn and my property boundary. These areas, especially the dense meadow area, are favorite hangouts of dark-eyed juncos, white-throated sparrows, American tree sparrows, song sparrows, and northern cardinals that feed on the weed seeds and use the dense cover to move between the shrubby edges, conifer cover, and the bird feeders I have in different edges of my property. I never mow the meadow area, so it has a dense thatch layer which insect-eating garter snakes love during the growing season. And during the winter, this thatch provides cover for meadow voles and redback voles and is often a favorite hunting area of sharp-shinned hawks, northern goshawks, and occasionally a bobcat. I don't plant any trees or shrubs in this meadow area because the voles that are attracted to the thatch can girdle woody plants in winter. So just a word of warning, keep deep thatch away from the bottoms of your trees and shrubs to minimize damage by voles in winter. Now, if my wild meadow is a little too wild for your taste, we can accomplish similar food and cover aspects with more organized and formal plantings. For example, we can use tall annual plants such as sunflowers, sorghum, and millet, arranged in densely planted blocks or in strips that provide a visual barrier between properties. If these plants are left uncut, they will provide tall seed heads during winter and provide cover to help wildlife move between different habitat features within a yard. When planted in wide, dense plantings, the native warm season grasses can be a unique and attractive landscape feature that provides patches or edges of cover and seeds for wildlife in winter. I've listed the grasses here in their order of height, from eastern gamma grass and big blue stem that can grow up to 10 feet tall, down to the little blue stem and side oats grama, which are usually less than 3 feet tall. So there are options based on the space and function you want the plants to fill. The stems of switchgrass usually are among the most stout of the grasses. When planted dense, they can hold quite a bit of snow up above the ground, and many songbirds will use the covered space underneath as overnight shelter. Most of these grasses compete best in very dry and low pH soils, but a few will grow in moist sites. Now, when you're establishing any plantings that you hope will function as cover, it's really important that you make your plantings as wide and dense as possible. As a general rule, if you can see through the plants, like in the picture on the left, the planting isn't dense or wide enough to provide great cover. Dense plantings, like we see on the right, have a superior ability to slow wind, allow wildlife to avoid the elements, and to provide a visual barrier that allows wildlife to avoid predators and feel safe as they move through your yard. When planted on property edges, dense plantings can function as living fences to provide privacy from neighbors. Dense shrubs or dense arrangements of shrubs can also be used to provide wildlife with year-round cover, and when located on property edges, can provide privacy and slow the wind. 2 native shrub species that grow tall and very densely include American hazelnut and ninebark, which both grow best on dry to moist sites. Hazelnuts are edible by people, but usually the squirrels devour them just as they're getting ripe. 9 bark produces a persistent fruit or seed, and it tends to be pretty deer resistant. As far as cover goes, conifers by far provide the best year-round cover from the elements and from predators. Spruce, fir, hemlock, cedar, and juniper provide great winter cover because their dense growth habit, stiff branches, and short needles are great at slowing wind and capturing the snow. Pines, with their long and weak needles, tend to be poor cover unless they are planted very densely. Now, while individual softwoods do provide cover and can facilitate wildlife movement through an otherwise inhospitable landscape, groups of closely spaced conifers definitely provide superior protection from the elements and from predators. Dense arrangements of tall conifers usually make the most sense along the edges of a yard, but dense plantings of low-growing juniper can be used to provide patches of dense ground-level cover without interrupting sight lines. When adding conifers or fruiting trees and shrubs, consider locating these habitat features immediately adjacent to one another. This is a great way to provide birds and small mammals with access to food without having to travel far from the cover that protects them from the elements and from predators. Bird feeders and bird baths located close to dense conifer cover are usually favored by birds during the winter. Now, here in New England, we have about 35 wildlife species that require dead and dying trees for denning, nesting, and or foraging. During winter, living or dead trees with cavities provide critical winter shelter for many species of small and medium-sized mammals and birds. Many birds, such as woodpeckers, nuthatches, titmice, and chickadees, forage for insects within and under the bark of dead trees or on dead tree limbs. Wherever safety isn't an issue, retaining dead and dying trees is an easy way to support wildlife that may disappear from your property if these features are removed. Note, however, if you remove the cavity tree that houses the flying squirrels, you give those squirrels a reason to move into your attic. Now, regarding water, in winter, wildlife can usually meet all of their water needs from natural sources of water, including any place where water isn't frozen, and from the water contained within the fruits, seeds, snow, and or prey items they eat. However, it's my observation that birds and squirrels will regularly drink water when it is provided in a bird bath. There are many styles of heated bird baths that make it easy to provide a reliable water source throughout the winter. I run an extension cord to a heated bird bath that I have near my house. I wrap the connection with electrical tape to ensure it's watertight. I'll end this presentation with a few final thoughts or considerations for how to design landscapes that function ecologically for wildlife. First, I want to reiterate the importance of incorporating wide and dense plantings throughout all aspects of your landscape design. This picture characterizes most suburban and business landscapes, which are usually dominated by short grass-mowed lawn and very narrow, sparse plantings. Here, not only is the design somewhat plain and lacking interest, but year-round cover and foraging opportunities for wildlife are few, plant diversity is usually pretty low, and there is little or no redundancy in the plantings, meaning that if a particular plant dies, there usually isn't another in place to provide a similar type of food or cover. We can improve this scenario by widening the areas of the plantings and making them more structurally complex. This is accomplished by simply allowing vegetation to grow and or adding dense plantings in all vegetation layers, including the ground layer, the shrub layer, short tree, and tall tree layers. The goal is to convert straight bands of narrow cover into wider bands with dense peninsulas of complex and diverse cover. On all lots, but especially on small lots, the edges or backs of properties are usually the easiest places to widen and diversify your plantings. Whenever possible, work collaboratively among neighbors to extend bands of cover among adjacent lots. This not only enhances privacy between lots, but it can significantly enhance the habitat value of the neighborhood by making it easier for wildlife to move throughout the larger landscape. The ideas and recommendations I provide in this presentation can be applied to maintain and enhance wildlife habitat at any scale. As a professional wildlife biologist and forester, I regularly apply the same basic concepts regardless of whether my landscape is a small urban green space, a residential lot, or hundreds of acres of forests, fields, and wetlands. Each landscape has its own nuances, constraints, and opportunities, but the underlying ecological concepts are the same, and we can provide and improve habitat for wildlife at any of these scales. Regardless of the scale you're working at, the best way to improve habitat within your neighborhood and to attract wildlife to your property is to design your landscape in a manner that complements the properties that surround you. For example, on your land, prioritize maintaining or adding different plant species that fruit at different times and that produce different fruits than the plants growing on your neighbor's land. Maintain or add niches that are uncommon in your neighborhood. For example, if there are no dense conifers in your neighbor's property, adding a conifer or two may significantly enhance cover options to wildlife. Also, maybe you have the only lot large enough to safely retain dead trees. Keeping large standing dead trees on your land may be the primary reason why pileated woodpeckers are in your neighborhood. Or maybe you don't have enough room to plant multiple apple trees to get the best pollination. Well, if your neighbor has a crab apple, plant your apple tree near your property edge so the two trees can cross-pollinate. Ideally, you should visit with your neighbors and also conduct a remote assessment using aerial photos to learn what food, cover, and water components occur around your land, and then plan your landscape design to complement those features. In this last slide, I just want to say a few words about the habitat role of non-native invasive plants in our landscape. Many non-native invasive shrubs and vines provide a high-quality year-round cover, and many produce persistent fruit. In many landscapes today, these plants may provide the only cover and fruit available to wildlife in winter. This is especially common in areas where there are too many deer, and the invasive plants are the only plants that aren't overbrowsed and killed by deer. If you have invasive plants on your property, don't rush out and remove them simply because they are non-native or have the potential to be invasive. These plants do have wildlife value, and if you simply remove them without also replacing them with other plants that provide similar habitat function, you can very easily reduce habitat quality. In the notes below, I provide a link to another presentation in which I review all of the research that compares how non-native invasive plants compare to native plants as habitat for wildlife to help you make good landscape decisions on your land. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or if you would like more information about any of the material I've presented here. In the show notes below, I provide a link to another presentation in which I provide recommendations for how to encourage wildlife diversity year-round in design landscapes, and a link to a presentation that highlights how I have eradicated Japanese knotweed from my property without using herbicides.